Emily's new shift. Emily Carter entered Bright Hope Medical Center with a sense of anticipation. She had been hired as a temporary nurse, a role that felt like a lifeline after searching for steady work. Nursing was her calling, a path she had chosen out of a genuine desire to help others in their moments of vulnerability. As she stepped through the automatic doors, the faint smell of antiseptic filled her senses, reinforcing her sense of duty. Each shift was a chance to prove herself, a new beginning in an environment where lives hung in the balance. Bright Hope was a well-respected hospital in the community, but as a temp, Emily felt like she was always walking on eggshells, constantly proving her worth. The bustling corridors teemed with urgency, doctors in white coats, nurses pushing carts, the rhythmic beeping of monitors signaling the constant activity of patient care. Emily weaved her way through the maze of activity, her scrubs pristine, her mind focused on the tasks at hand. After reaching the locker room and slipping into her scrubs, Emily took a deep breath, trying to shake off the usual nervousness that accompanied a new shift. Her temporary status meant she often rotated between departments, a challenge she had grown accustomed to. Still, the weight of uncertainty sat heavily on her shoulders. Today, however, felt different. A nagging feeling of unease lingered in her chest as she began her rounds, an intuition she couldn't quite explain. As she walked through the hallways, Emily found herself assigned to a new wing. She passed room after room, her footsteps echoing softly. The stillness of the hospital at this early hour contrasted sharply with the frantic pace she knew would build as the day went on. It was during this quiet moment that she heard it, the muffled sound of someone crying. Emily stopped in her tracks, her ears straining to catch the direction of the sound. The noise grew louder as she neared room 237. She felt an inexplicable pang of dread in her stomach, as though she were on the brink of discovering something terrible. Taking a deep breath to steady her nerves, she placed her hand on the door and pushed it open gently. Inside the room, she saw an elderly man lying in bed, his thin frame hunched over as he sobbed quietly. The sight tugged at her heart. He wore a hospital gown that seemed a size too big, barely covering his frail body. His skin was a beautiful, rich mahogany, but his face was etched with pain and sorrow. Beside the bed, a urine bottle lay tipped over on the floor, its contents staining the linoleum yellow. The acrid smell mixed with the hospital's sterile air, creating a nauseating blend that made her stomach turn. Emily's gaze swept the room, taking in details that filled her with a growing sense of unease. The call button lay just out of his reach on the far side of the bed, and his gown was soiled. It was clear he had been left unattended for far too long. She felt a rush of anger at the neglect, at the sight of a vulnerable patient who seemed to have slipped through the cracks of care. The man lifted his head as she approached, his eyes meeting hers. Relief flickered across his face as he recognized her as a nurse, a figure he could place his trust in. His voice was rough, likely from crying, as he whispered, "Thank you. Thank you for coming." Emily knelt beside his bed, taking his hand gently. "Mr. Jenkins, I'm here to help you. Can you tell me how long you've been feeling like this?" His eyes filled with fresh tears as he spoke, his voice trembling with frustration. "I've been trying to get someone to help me for days," he croaked. "I told them I was in pain, that something wasn't right. But they look at me like I'm some senile old fool. I know my own body. I know when something's wrong." Emily squeezed his hand, a mixture of sorrow and anger churning within her. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Jenkins. I can't imagine how hard this has been for you. I'm here now, and I promise I'll do everything I can to help." Mr. Jenkins's gaze grew more intense as he looked at her, his face a mask of pain and frustration. "It's because of this," he said, lifting his hand and brushing his dark skin with trembling fingers. "They look at me, and they see an old black man who's lost his mind. They think I don't know what I'm talking about." Emily felt a chill run down her spine as his words sank in. His tone held a bitterness born from years of discrimination and dismissal, a truth too heavy to ignore. She struggled to process the implications, the possibility that Mr. Jenkins was not only suffering neglect, but that it might be a result of prejudice within the walls of Bright Hope. The silence that followed was thick, heavy with the weight of his accusation. Emily wanted to tell him it couldn't be true, that there was no way a hospital like Bright Hope would allow such bias to affect patient care. But as she looked at him, taking in the signs of neglect that were now glaringly apparent, she found herself grappling with the troubling reality that perhaps Mr. Jenkins's fears were not unfounded. She fought to keep her voice steady. "Mr. Jenkins, I'm going to get you cleaned up and make sure you're comfortable. I'll document everything, and I'll make sure your concerns are addressed." A flicker of hope passed through his eyes, but it was faint, weighed down by the lingering fear and exhaustion. "Thank you, Nurse Carter," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I just want to be seen, to be treated like a person." Emily's heart broke at his words. She gathered the supplies she needed and began cleaning him up, changing his gown and adjusting his bed to make him more comfortable. Her hands moved on autopilot as she worked, her mind racing with the implications of what she just heard. She could feel her resolve hardening, her commitment to do whatever it took to ensure Mr. Jenkins received the care he deserved. As she finished, Emily noticed that Mr. Jenkins's breathing seemed more relaxed, his face softening as he finally found a measure of comfort. "I'm here, Mr. Jenkins," she reassured him. "You're not alone." He nodded weakly, his eyes heavy with gratitude and fatigue. As he drifted into a much-needed sleep, Emily sat by his bedside, her mind whirring with questions and doubts. She knew that if she chose to pursue this, she would be venturing into dangerous territory, speaking up against potential discrimination, particularly as a temporary nurse, could jeopardize her job, her career even. Would anyone listen to her? Would her accusations be dismissed as the concerns of an inexperienced temp? But as she looked at Mr. Jenkins, lying there in a state of vulnerability that no patient should have to endure, Emily felt a fierce sense of purpose ignite within her. She knew that her duty went beyond merely performing tasks and checking boxes. It was about standing up for patients who couldn't advocate for themselves, especially when the system seemed to fail them. With her jaw set and her heart pounding, Emily rose from her seat and made her way to the nurse's station. She would document every detail of Mr. Jenkins's condition, every sign of neglect, and she would take this to the hospital administration if needed. The silent struggle. Emily sat at the nurse's station, her mind whirling as she meticulously documented every detail of Mr. Jenkins's condition. Each note felt like a small act of defiance, a declaration that she wouldn't let this man's suffering go unseen. Her fingers moved quickly across the page, recording every observation. His soiled gown, the tipped-over urine bottle, the call button out of reach. These details, innocuous on their own, painted a picture of neglect when viewed together. A heaviness pressed down on her as she wrote, each word amplifying the realization that something was deeply wrong. The hallway around her was alive with the usual symphony of hospital sounds, the beeping of monitors, the murmured voices of colleagues, and the occasional squeak of a gurney wheel. But Emily felt detached from it all, as if she were trapped in a bubble of silence, alone with the implications of what she was about to set in motion. The stakes were high. As a temp, she was painfully aware that her position was far more precarious than that of her full-time colleagues. Speaking out could cost her this job and any future prospects, and yet the thought of walking away weighed even more heavily on her. Her thoughts were interrupted by a voice behind her. "Emily, everything okay?" She turned to see Sarah, a senior nurse she'd only recently met. Sarah's presence was comforting. She was known for her empathy and had a reputation for standing up for patients' rights. Emily hesitated, unsure if she should involve anyone else, but something in Sarah's warm gaze encouraged her. "It's Mr. Jenkins in room 237, Emily began, her voice barely a whisper. "I found him in a state that I can't ignore. His call button was out of reach, his gown was filthy, and he's been in pain for days without anyone addressing it." Emily paused, struggling to hold back the anger simmering just beneath the surface. He thinks his complaints are being ignored because of his race. Sarah's face softened with a mixture of empathy and worry. Oh, Emily, I've seen it before too. We try our best, but sometimes patients like Mr. Jenkins fall through the cracks. It's wrong, and it's heartbreaking. Emily felt a surge of relief knowing she wasn't alone in her concerns. I'm planning to report it. I know it's risky, especially as a temp. But I can't just let it go. Sarah placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. You're doing the right thing, Emily. It takes courage, especially in your position. But if you're determined to pursue this, just know that you have allies here. I'll back you up if it comes to that. Emily nodded, grateful for Sarah's support. But as Sarah walked away, Emily's relief was quickly replaced by a creeping sense of dread. She knew that standing up against the system, even with allies, could be like stepping into a storm. Taking a steadying breath, Emily stood and made her way toward the administrative office, clutching her documentation tightly. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly in front of her, every step an act of defiance. She felt her heart pounding, her mind racing with the possible outcomes. Reporting concerns was one thing, but alleging potential bias, that was uncharted territory, especially for a temporary nurse. The very walls of the hospital seemed to close in on her, as though aware of the disruption she was about to cause. She reached the administrative office and hesitated for a moment, her fingers brushing against the door handle. The image of Mr. Jenkins flashed in her mind. His frail figure, the resignation in his eyes, his whispered plea for help. That image dissolved her last trace of hesitation, and she pushed the door open. The office was silent, a stark contrast to the bustling corridors outside. Behind a large wooden desk sat Mr. Thornton, the hospital administrator, his face a mask of professionalism. He looked up as she entered, his expression shifting to one of mild surprise. "Ah, Nurse Carter, isn't it?" he asked, his tone polite but distant. "Is there something urgent?" "Yes, sir," Emily replied, her voice steadier than she expected. "I need to discuss a serious concern regarding a patient's care." Mr. Thornton gestured for her to sit, folding his hands and waiting expectantly. Emily took a seat, feeling the weight of her decision settle over her like a cloak. She took a deep breath and began to speak, detailing everything she had observed in Mr. Jenkins' room. She described his condition, her suspicions of neglect, and finally, the distressing possibility of racial bias influencing his care. The administrator's expression hardened slightly as she spoke, but he remained silent, his gaze never leaving hers. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair, his face carefully neutral. "Nurse Carter, you're a temporary nurse here, are you not?" he asked, his tone measured. Emily's heart skipped a beat at the pointed reminder of her status, but she nodded. "Yes, sir, I am. But I believe that my temporary status shouldn't prevent me from advocating for my patients." A faint smirk crossed his lips, though his eyes remained cold. "I appreciate your dedication, Nurse Carter, but I want you to understand the gravity of what you're suggesting. Allegations of this nature are serious and can have far-reaching consequences." Emily swallowed, her throat dry, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. "I'm aware of that, sir, but Mr. Jenkins deserves to be heard. Ignoring his concerns would go against everything I believe as a nurse." Mr. Thornton held her gaze for a moment longer, and Emily felt a flicker of doubt. Would he dismiss her concerns, labeling her as an overzealous temp who didn't understand the intricacies of hospital operations? Finally, he spoke, his tone neutral but laced with a hint of condescension. "Very well. Submit your documentation, and we'll conduct a preliminary review. However, I must caution you, Nurse Carter. Accusations like these are taken very seriously, and if they are found to be unsubstantiated, they could reflect poorly on you." Emily felt her cheeks flush with frustration, but she bit back her retort. Instead, she nodded, keeping her voice calm. "Understood, sir. I'll submit everything I've documented." With that, she rose and left the office, her pulse racing. The moment she stepped back into the hallway, she felt a wave of self-doubt. Would anyone take her seriously? She knew Mr. Thornton's words had been a warning, a reminder of the fragility of her position as a temporary nurse. But as she glanced down the hallway, catching sight of Mr. Jenkins's room, her resolve solidified. She wasn't doing this for herself. She was doing it for him, and for every patient who had ever felt voiceless. As the hours passed, Emily's shift continued, though her mind was consumed by the weight of her decision. Whispers began to circulate among the staff, and she could feel the tension building around her. She noticed some colleagues glancing at her with curiosity, while others avoided her gaze altogether. Sarah offered her a supportive smile as she passed, but Emily sensed the undercurrent of unease rippling through the hospital. Her actions had stirred something within Bright Hope, and there was no telling what might happen next. By the end of her shift, Emily felt drained, the emotional toll settling heavily on her. She was exhausted, not just from the physical demands of the day, but from the mental strain of pushing against a system that often seemed more concerned with image than with patient care. But as she made her way to the locker room, she knew she couldn't let her fears deter her. She would return the next day and the day after that, continuing to document and advocate as best she could. Just as she was about to leave, she felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to see Dr. Simmons, a senior physician she'd admired from afar. His expression was serious, his brow furrowed in concern. "I heard about your report, Nurse Carter," he said quietly. It took courage to speak up, especially given your position. Emily nodded, taken aback by his acknowledgement. "Thank you, Dr. Simmons. I couldn't ignore what I saw." He gave her a small, approving nod. "And you shouldn't. Our duty is to our patients, first and foremost. But remember, change doesn't come easily, especially in a place as complex as this hospital. Be prepared for resistance." Emily felt a surge of gratitude for his support, however cautious it might be. "I will. Thank you." As she walked out of the hospital, her mind was a whirlwind of emotions. She had taken the first step, but she knew the path ahead would be filled with challenges and obstacles. But she also knew that she couldn't stop now. She had lit a spark, one that could either ignite real change or be snuffed out by the forces working against her. With each step, Emily felt her resolve strengthen. Whatever came next, she would face it head-on, fueled by the belief that every patient deserved to be seen, heard, and cared for with dignity. Confrontation and consequence. The following day, Emily returned to Bright Hope Medical Center with a knot of anxiety coiled tightly in her stomach. She had barely slept, her mind churning through countless scenarios and possibilities. As she stepped into the hospital, the familiar antiseptic smell hit her, grounding her momentarily in routine. But the usual hum of anticipation she felt at the start of a shift had been replaced by a profound sense of uncertainty. She knew she'd crossed an invisible line by reporting Mr. Jenkins's case, and there was no telling how the hospital administration would react. As she approached the nurse's station, she noticed the change in atmosphere almost immediately. Conversations hushed as she drew near, and colleagues exchanged furtive glances when they thought she wasn't looking. The whispers followed her like a shadow, the weight of judgment settling over her. Some looked at her with respect, their nods of acknowledgement subtle but sincere. Others, however, kept their distance, their expressions veiled with suspicion or outright disapproval. Sarah, the senior nurse who had offered her encouragement the previous day, gave her a gentle smile as Emily began her rounds. "Just keep your head down," Sarah whispered, leaning close enough so only Emily could hear. "People are watching you closely, but remember, you're not alone in this." Emily nodded, grateful for Sarah's words, but acutely aware of the isolation she still felt. She couldn't shake the feeling that her every move was being scrutinized. The hospital, which had once felt like a place of purpose and healing, now felt like a stage where every gesture, every word, was being observed and analyzed. Her first patient was a middle-aged woman recovering from surgery. Emily went through the usual motions, checking vitals, adjusting pillows, offering words of comfort. But her mind remained occupied by the events of the day before. She wondered if Mr. Thornton had started his so-called preliminary review of Mr. Jenkins's case, or if it was simply a formality, a way to placate her while maintaining the status quo. As she moved down the hallway, she couldn't resist the pull to check on Mr. Jenkins. When she reached his room, she found him lying in bed, his frail frame almost swallowed by the blankets. His eyes were closed, and his breathing was shallow but steady. Relief flooded through her. He seemed to be resting, at least for now. Just as she was about to leave the room, she felt a presence behind her. Turning, she came face to face with Dr. Grant, the head physician of the department, her posture rigid and her expression icy. "Nurse Carter," Dr. Grant said, her tone sharp and unyielding. "I'd like to have a word with you in my office." The request sounded more like a command, and Emily felt her heart begin to race. She followed Dr. Grant down the hallway, her mind scrambling to prepare for whatever confrontation lay ahead. She had heard stories about Dr. Grant, stories of her being exacting and unyielding, with little tolerance for what she saw as insubordination or overstepping boundaries. Emily braced herself as they reached Dr. Grant's office, the door closing with a final, almost ominous click behind her. Dr. Grant sat behind her desk, folding her hands neatly as she studied Emily with a steely gaze. "Do you know why you're here, Nurse Carter?" she asked, her voice laced with a chilling calm. Emily straightened her shoulders, forcing herself to hold Dr. Grant's gaze. "I assume it's about my report regarding Mr. Jenkins," she replied, striving to keep her voice steady. A faint smirk tugged at the corners of Dr. Grant's mouth, though her eyes remained cold. "That's correct," she said. "I've reviewed your documentation, and I find your concerns interesting. But I must remind you, Nurse Carter, that our protocols are in place for a reason. Your accusations against this institution and its staff are serious and, frankly, inappropriate, especially considering your temporary status here." Emily's cheeks flushed with anger, but she held her ground. "Dr. Grant, I understand my position, but I believe every patient deserves proper care and respect, regardless of their background. Mr. Jenkins expressed to me that he felt his complaints were being ignored due to racial bias. I documented his condition as objectively as possible, and I stand by my observations." Dr. Grant's expression hardened, her voice lowering to a dangerous whisper. "And you thought it wise to accuse one of your superiors of racial discrimination. You have no idea of the consequences such allegations can have, not just for the individuals involved, but for this entire hospital." Emily's heart pounded, but she forced herself to stay composed. "I'm not accusing anyone specifically, Dr. Grant. I'm merely advocating for a patient who felt neglected. I documented what I observed, and I believe it's our duty to take these concerns seriously." Dr. Grant leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "Listen carefully, Nurse Carter. You're walking on very thin ice. This hospital does not tolerate unfounded allegations, and if you persist with this line of inquiry, you may find your time at Bright Hope cut short. Do I make myself clear?" The threat hung in the air, heavy and menacing. Emily felt a surge of fear, but she refused to let it show. Instead, she met Dr. Grant's gaze, her voice unwavering. "Crystal clear, Dr. Grant, but I won't ignore what I saw. If advocating for my patients means risking my position, then so be it." Dr. Grant's lips pressed into a thin line, her expression a mixture of anger and disbelief. "Very well, Nurse Carter, but know this. You're not irreplaceable. Temp or not, there are plenty of others who would be more than happy to take your place." With that, Dr. Grant dismissed her with a curt nod. Emily turned on her heel, leaving the office with her head held high, though her heart felt like it might burst from the tension. She made her way back to the nurse's station, feeling as though she had just walked through fire. She knew Dr. Grant's words were more than just a warning. They were a clear indication that her job was now on the line. But even in the face of this threat, Emily felt a sense of resolve harden within her. She couldn't let fear dictate her actions, not when her patients depended on her. The rest of the shift passed in a blur, the events of the confrontation replaying in her mind. She noticed the continued whispers and glances from her colleagues, some curious, others judgmental. The tension in the hospital was palpable, as if everyone were waiting for the other shoe to drop. Later that evening, as she was preparing to leave, Emily noticed a commotion near Mr. Jenkins' room. Her heart leaped into her throat as she rushed over, fearing the worst. When she arrived, she saw 2 nurses and a doctor standing outside his room, their expressions grim. Sarah, who had been assisting with Mr. Jenkins's care, caught sight of Emily and motioned her over. "Emily," she whispered, her face pale. "Mr. Jenkins's condition took a turn. He's stable for now, but it was close." Emily felt a wave of relief tempered by lingering dread. "What happened?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah glanced around to make sure no one else was listening. He was showing signs of severe dehydration and infection. It's like his condition was allowed to deteriorate over time without anyone noticing. Emily's stomach twisted at the realization. She had been right about the neglect, but the confirmation brought little comfort. Instead, it filled her with a renewed sense of urgency. She couldn't afford to stay silent. Not now. Determined, Emily headed to the break room, where she pulled out her phone and dialed the number for the hospital's patient advocacy department. Her hand shook as she waited for someone to pick up, her mind racing with everything she wanted to say. Finally, a voice answered, professional and calm. "This is Lisa from Patient Advocacy. How may I assist you?" Emily took a deep breath, steeling herself. "Hello, Lisa. My name is Nurse Emily Carter, and I need to report a serious case of patient neglect and potential discrimination. The patient is Mr. Harold Jenkins, room 237. I have documentation and personal observations that I believe warrant an investigation." The line went silent for a moment, and Emily feared the worst, that her concerns would once again be dismissed. But then Lisa's voice came through, measured but understanding. "Thank you for bringing this to our attention, Nurse Carter. This is a very serious matter. I'll need you to submit all relevant documentation, and we'll begin an investigation immediately." Emily felt a surge of relief tempered by lingering apprehension. "Thank you, Lisa. I'll gather everything and send it over." After ending the call, Emily leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. She had done everything she could, submitted her documentation, made her case, and now she could only wait. She knew the coming days would be tense, with the investigation putting her directly at odds with Dr. Grant and possibly others within the hospital. But as she thought of Mr. Jenkins lying in that hospital bed, vulnerable and alone, Emily felt a fierce sense of purpose swell within her. As she walked out of the hospital that night, Emily felt a strange sense of calm. She had faced the fire and hadn't backed down. The path ahead was uncertain, and she knew she'd face resistance, maybe even outright hostility. But she also knew that she was doing what was right, and no matter the consequences, that knowledge would carry her forward. The storm breaks. Over the next few days, Emily felt the quiet storm brewing around her at Bright Hope Medical Center. Though she did her best to focus on her patients and stay out of the rumor mill, she couldn't ignore the escalating tension that shadowed her every step. News of her report had spread, not just as gossip among the nurses, but as a rumor circulating through every rank of the hospital. The mere mention of Mr. Jenkins's case brought hushed conversations and careful glances. The atmosphere was a pressure cooker, and Emily was at the center of it all. She continued her work, doing her best to block out the whispers and disapproving stares. It wasn't long, however, before the first true test of her resolve came. Late in the afternoon, Emily was in the middle of helping a new patient settle in when she was paged to the administrative office. Her heart sank. She knew this could only mean one thing. She walked the familiar corridor leading to the administrative wing, her pulse racing. She felt as though she were walking into a lion's den. Upon arriving, she was greeted by a secretary who guided her to the conference room rather than Mr. Thornton's office, a clear indication that this would be more than a one-on-one discussion. As she entered, Emily was met with a somber sight. Mr. Thornton sat at the head of the long conference table, his face unreadable. Beside him was Dr. Grant, whose glare was colder and sharper than ever. There were a few other department heads present as well, each of them with an expression that seemed somewhere between suspicion and disappointment. It was a stark reminder of her precarious position, a temporary nurse daring to challenge the hospital's practices. Emily took a seat at the far end of the table, clasping her hands tightly in her lap to keep them from shaking. She met Mr. Thornton's gaze, waiting for him to begin, knowing she had to remain calm and resolute no matter what was said. Mr. Thornton cleared his throat, his voice measured and professional. "Nurse Carter, thank you for coming. We've called this meeting to address some serious allegations you've raised regarding patient care, specifically concerning Mr. Harold Jenkins." Emily nodded, her voice steady as she replied, "Thank you for the opportunity, sir. I'm here to answer any questions you have." Mr. Thornton looked at her carefully, as if searching for any hint of uncertainty. "You understand, of course, that your accusations carry significant weight, and they also bear serious implications. You're suggesting not only negligence but also potential racial bias in patient care, a claim that can impact the hospital's reputation and the careers of many here." Emily swallowed but nodded firmly. "I do understand that, sir, but I believe it's a matter of integrity to ensure that Mr. Jenkins and every patient receives the care they deserve, without prejudice." At this, Dr. Grant leaned forward, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Nurse Carter," she began, her tone dripping with disdain, "I want to remind you of your place here. You're a temporary nurse with limited experience at this facility. You do not know our staff, nor the rigor of our protocols. To suggest that I, or any other physician here, would treat a patient differently based on their race is not only insulting but entirely unfounded." Emily felt her cheeks flush with a mixture of anger and frustration. "Dr. Grant, I'm not attacking you or anyone else personally. I'm merely reporting what I observed and what Mr. Jenkins expressed to me. It's my duty as a nurse to advocate for my patients, regardless of my employment status." The room fell silent as Emily's words hung in the air. Mr. Thornton cleared his throat again, his face betraying a flicker of something. Whether it was disapproval or doubt, Emily couldn't tell. He leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. "Dr. Grant, I believe we all understand the seriousness of the allegations," he said, his voice softer but still firm. "However, we cannot dismiss the claims without a thorough investigation." Dr. Grant shot him a look of thinly veiled resentment but said nothing. Emily felt a brief flash of gratitude for Mr. Thornton's professionalism, though she remained on edge. She knew that the hospital had little choice but to conduct an investigation, yet she also understood that the outcome was far from guaranteed to be in her favor. "Thank you, Mr. Thornton," Emily said, her tone controlled. "I have provided documentation of Mr. Jenkins's condition, as well as his own words regarding his treatment. I believe it's important to approach this with transparency and a willingness to look closely at all the details." Mr. Thornton nodded, acknowledging her point. "Very well. We'll begin an official inquiry into Mr. Jenkins's case. During this period, Nurse Carter, you may continue with your regular duties, but I ask that you refrain from discussing this matter with other staff members. It's essential to keep this process confidential and unbiased." Emily nodded, understanding the underlying message. This was her chance to either demonstrate professionalism or risk looking like a troublemaker. She felt the weight of the unspoken ultimatum pressing down on her. After a few more formalities, she was dismissed, and as she left the conference room, she could feel Dr. Grant's eyes burning into her back. The next few days passed in a surreal haze. Emily continued her work as usual, though she felt as if she were constantly under a microscope. Every action, every interaction was being watched, evaluated. She noticed some colleagues avoided her altogether, as if merely being associated with her could bring unwanted attention. Others, like Sarah, offered subtle gestures of support, a smile here, a quick word of encouragement there. These small acts of kindness were a lifeline in the otherwise isolating experience. The investigation into Mr. Jenkins's case was underway, and though she was not directly involved, Emily felt its presence like a storm gathering on the horizon. She couldn't shake the feeling that the outcome, whatever it might be, would change her career forever. Then, one evening as she was finishing her shift, she noticed a familiar face outside Mr. Jenkins's room. It was Lisa, the patient advocate she had spoken to earlier. Lisa was speaking with Mr. Jenkins, her expression one of compassion and attentiveness. Emily's heart swelled with hope, seeing that her concerns were finally being taken seriously. She stood nearby, waiting for Lisa to finish, hoping for a chance to speak with her. After a few moments, Lisa noticed Emily and approached her with a warm smile. "Nurse Carter," she greeted her. "I've just had a very enlightening conversation with Mr. Jenkins. He's expressed his gratitude for your dedication and advocacy." Emily felt a mixture of relief and pride. "Thank you, Lisa. I'm just glad he's being heard." Lisa nodded, her face growing serious. "Mr. Jenkins has raised concerns that mirror some troubling patterns we've noticed in our reviews. It's early, but there's evidence to suggest that systemic issues may be impacting patient care, especially for patients of certain backgrounds." Emily's stomach turned. She had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed filled her with a renewed sense of urgency. "What happens now?" Lisa sighed. "The investigation will continue, and there may be changes to how we handle patient feedback and reviews. I'll be meeting with administration soon to discuss some preliminary findings, but I wanted to let you know that your actions have already sparked a necessary conversation." Emily felt a surge of gratitude, though it was tempered by a lingering worry. "Do you think they'll listen?" Lisa smiled, though there was a hint of sadness in her eyes. "They'll have to. The weight of evidence is mounting, and public scrutiny is a powerful motivator. But change is slow, and it's not without resistance." As Lisa left, Emily felt a mixture of hope and trepidation. She had set something in motion, something far bigger than herself, or even Mr. Jenkins. She returned to her rounds with renewed determination, though she knew the road ahead was far from smooth. Later that night, Emily received an unexpected message on her phone. It was from Dr. Simmons, the physician she had admired from afar. The message was short, but its impact was profound. "Thank you for standing up, Nurse Carter. Your actions are inspiring more than you realize. Keep going." Emily's heart swelled as she read the words. She hadn't realized just how much support she had, hidden behind the veiled looks and whispers. As she lay in bed that night, reflecting on everything that had happened, she felt a sense of resolve settle over her. She was ready to face whatever came next, armed with the knowledge that she was not alone in this fight. The following morning, she awoke to find news of the investigation circulating within the hospital community, whispers turning into open conversations. The tension that had simmered beneath the surface now boiled over, reaching every department. The hospital administration announced a new initiative to address systemic issues in patient care, sparking both hope and controversy. Emily knew she had crossed into a new chapter of her career, one that would be defined by her decision to stand up, regardless of the consequences. And as she walked through the familiar halls of Bright Hope Medical Center, she felt a renewed sense of purpose, ready to face the challenges that awaited. The path was daunting, but she was determined to walk it, knowing that she had the strength and conviction to see it through. The hospital under scrutiny. The days that followed were a whirlwind for Emily. The initial waves of tension and secrecy had escalated into a full-blown storm, sweeping through Bright Hope Medical Center. What had begun as an inquiry into Mr. Jenkins's care had quickly evolved into a broader investigation into the hospital's treatment practices. Emily could feel the mounting pressure with every step she took, her colleagues' reactions growing increasingly polarized. Some openly avoided her, their expressions a mix of fear and resentment, while others, like Sarah and Dr. Simmons, showed their support through brief smiles or quiet words of encouragement. Still, Emily knew she was at the center of a firestorm that might burn her career. One morning, just as she arrived for her shift, she was called to an impromptu meeting with the hospital's new investigative team. The head of the team was a tall, stern woman named Dr. Linda Hart, brought in from a reputable external agency specializing in medical ethics and compliance. With her sharp gaze and no-nonsense demeanor, Dr. Hart made it clear from the beginning that her team would be conducting an exhaustive investigation, and no stone would be left unturned. The meeting room was filled with officials, some from the state's Department of Health, as well as a few members of the press invited for transparency. Emily felt a chill run down her spine as she took a seat, feeling like a witness preparing to testify in court. Dr. Hart stood at the front, addressing the room with the confidence of someone who had conducted countless similar investigations. "Thank you all for being here," Dr. Hart began, her voice calm but authoritative. "As many of you know, we're here because allegations have been raised regarding potential neglect and discriminatory practices at Bright Hope Medical Center. We'll be conducting interviews, reviewing documentation, and meeting with patients to ensure we're getting a full picture of what's been going on." Emily noticed Dr. Grant sitting across the room, her face tight with barely concealed anger. The usually composed physician now seemed visibly shaken, her posture defensive. For the first time, Emily realized that her report had put not only her own career at risk, but Dr. Grant's as well. This wasn't merely about challenging a policy or protocol. This was a direct threat to the careers and reputations of some of the hospital's most established professionals. As Dr. Hart continued outlining the investigation process, Emily felt a mixture of relief and dread. Relief that her concerns were being taken seriously and dread at the potential backlash. She knew she was risking everything by cooperating fully, but there was no turning back now. When the meeting adjourned, Dr. Hart gestured for Emily to stay behind. Once the room had cleared, Dr. Hart closed the door and took a seat across from Emily, her expression softening slightly. "Nurse Carter," she began, "I want to commend you for bringing your concerns forward. I know that speaking up in a place like this isn't easy, especially as a temporary nurse, but it's important that we address issues like these openly." Emily nodded, grateful for the acknowledgement, but feeling the weight of what lay ahead. "Thank you, Dr. Hart. I just want to make sure that Mr. Jenkins and any other patients in similar situations receive the care they deserve." Dr. Hart gave her a small, approving nod. "I understand. We'll need your cooperation throughout this process. I hope you're prepared for some resistance. These investigations often expose deeper issues within an institution, and not everyone will welcome the changes that come with that." Emily took a deep breath, bracing herself. "I'm ready, Dr. Hart. I knew there would be consequences, but I couldn't ignore what I saw." "Good," Dr. Hart said, a glint of respect in her eyes. "Stay strong, Nurse Carter. You're making a difference, even if it doesn't feel like it right now." Over the next week, the hospital seemed to transform under the weight of the investigation. Staff were questioned, patient records were combed through, and policies were scrutinized. Emily spent hours with Dr. Hart's team, providing her documentation and sharing details of her observations about Mr. Jenkins's care and the underlying patterns she had noticed. The more she spoke, the more she realized how entrenched the issues were. She recalled small instances over the past few months where patients of color had been overlooked or treated with less urgency. It was as if a dark thread ran beneath the hospital's shiny veneer, now unraveling before her eyes. The scrutiny placed the hospital under a microscope, and the effects were immediate. Media outlets picked up the story, framing it as a David and Goliath battle, a lone nurse standing up against the institution. Journalists camped outside the hospital gates, eager to capture sound bites and interview anyone willing to speak. Families of patients, past and present, began coming forward with their own stories, some echoing Mr. Jenkins's concerns and others sharing their gratitude for Emily's bravery. Despite the media storm, Emily kept her focus on her work, but the pressure was immense, and she felt the weight of every glance, every hushed conversation. Some of her colleagues saw her as a hero, while others resented her for exposing what they saw as their private world to public judgment. Even some of the patients had started to notice, asking her questions or offering sympathetic smiles. One evening, while Emily was working late, she received a message from an unknown number. She opened it cautiously, half expecting another cryptic warning or even a dismissal. Instead, it was a heartfelt message from a former patient. "Nurse Carter, I don't know if you remember me, but I was treated at Bright Hope last year. I've been following what's happening, and I just want to say thank you. I was afraid to speak up when I noticed the disparities in care, but seeing you fight has given me hope. Please don't give up." Emily's eyes filled with tears as she read the message, feeling the impact of her actions resonating beyond the hospital walls. She had often questioned whether her efforts would lead to meaningful change, but this message reminded her that she was fighting for something bigger than herself or even Mr. Jenkins. She was fighting for every patient who had ever felt overlooked, dismissed, or devalued. The next morning, however, Emily's resolve was tested yet again. Dr. Grant, visibly exhausted and agitated, approached her in the hallway, her face a mask of barely contained anger. "Nurse Carter," Dr. Grant began, her voice low but intense, "I don't think you fully understand what you've done. This investigation has cast doubt on the entire hospital. My reputation, my years of service, are now being questioned because of you. Do you have any idea what this will mean for me, for my career?" Emily took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "Dr. Grant, I understand that this is difficult, but it's not about you or me. It's about ensuring that every patient receives fair and compassionate care. I didn't intend to cause harm, but I couldn't ignore the harm already happening." Dr. Grant's face twisted in frustration. "I don't need a lecture on compassion from a temp. You think you're some kind of hero. You have no idea of the sacrifices we make here every day, the pressures we face. If this hospital suffers because of your self-righteous crusade, I hope you're prepared to take responsibility." Emily stood her ground, her voice unwavering. "I am prepared to take responsibility, Dr. Grant. That's why I spoke up. I understand the challenges of this work, but ignoring these issues only compounds the harm done to patients like Mr. Jenkins." Dr. Grant glared at her, speechless for a moment, before finally walking away, her shoulders tense. Emily watched her go, feeling a strange mixture of sadness and determination. She understood that Dr. Grant wasn't inherently unkind, but rather a product of a system that had normalized neglect and dehumanization. In a way, they were all trapped within that system, but Emily knew that someone had to be willing to break free and demand something better. In the days that followed, the investigation intensified. Dr. Hart's team interviewed more staff members, uncovering a range of issues that extended beyond Mr. Jenkins's case. They found evidence of disparities in treatment, delayed responses to patient requests, and a lack of transparency in handling patient complaints. The findings were damning, casting a harsh light on Bright Hope's practices. Finally, after weeks of relentless scrutiny, the investigation team called an all-staff meeting in the hospital's main auditorium. Emily arrived early, taking a seat near the back, her heart pounding as she waited for the results to be announced. The room was packed with nurses, doctors, administrators, and support staff, all brimming with anticipation. Dr. Hart took the stage, her expression calm but resolute. "Thank you all for being here," she began, her voice steady. "After a thorough investigation, we have identified multiple areas where Bright Hope Medical Center has failed to meet ethical and professional standards of patient care." A murmur rippled through the crowd, and Emily felt a surge of both relief and apprehension. Dr. Hart continued, outlining the investigation's findings in unflinching detail. She spoke about the disparities in treatment, the lack of accountability, and the troubling patterns in how certain patients were treated. The room was silent, the weight of her words settling heavily on everyone present. "We have recommended a series of reforms, including mandatory bias training, stricter protocols for patient complaints, and the establishment of a patient advocacy committee to oversee and address concerns in real time," Dr. Hart announced. "These changes are not optional. They are necessary to restore trust and to ensure that every patient receives the quality of care they deserve. As Dr. Hart concluded, a slow, tentative applause began to build, swelling into a wave of support. Emily felt a mixture of relief and pride, knowing that her actions had been the catalyst for this moment. She caught Sarah's eye across the room, who smiled at her, nodding in approval. The meeting ended, and as Emily walked through the hallways, she felt the atmosphere shift. Colleagues she barely knew approached her, offering words of gratitude and encouragement. Some hugged her, while others simply squeezed her shoulder in silent solidarity. Emily realized that, despite the trials she had faced, she had become a symbol of change, someone who had stood up when others remained silent. Later that evening, as she prepared to leave, she saw Mr. Jenkins's family waiting outside his room. They approached her, their faces filled with gratitude. "Thank you," his daughter said, her voice thick with emotion. "You've done more for him, and for all of us, than you can ever know." Emily felt tears prick at her eyes as she hugged her, feeling the weight of the family's appreciation settle over her like a warm blanket. She had set out to make a difference for one man, but she had ended up igniting a movement that would reshape the very fabric of Bright Hope. As she left the hospital that night, Emily felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had faced down fear, hostility, and doubt, emerging stronger than ever. The fight was far from over. Change was a slow, often painful process, but Emily knew that she was ready for whatever lay ahead. She was no longer just a temporary nurse. She was a force for change, a voice for the voiceless, and a guardian of the values she had sworn to uphold. A legacy of change. The changes at Bright Hope Medical Center unfolded in the weeks following the investigation's conclusion. The reforms Dr. Hart's team had recommended began to take root, though not without resistance. As Emily resumed her duties, she found herself navigating a transformed landscape, one where every decision, every policy, was under renewed scrutiny. But for the first time, she felt a real sense of hope that the hospital could become a place of genuine healing for all patients. The implementation of mandatory bias training was the first visible change. Every staff member, from top-tier physicians to the janitorial team, was required to attend. The sessions were tense, the room often thick with unspoken resentments and defensive stances. Emily noticed Dr. Grant's steely expression during the training, her posture tense, her eyes fixed forward, as if unwilling to fully engage. But other colleagues seemed genuinely receptive, nodding as they listened, asking questions, and reflecting on their own practices. The training sessions focused not only on identifying and addressing biases, but also on creating an environment of empathy and accountability. For many, it was an eye-opener, revealing just how deeply ingrained certain behaviors and assumptions had become. Emily watched as some of her colleagues, particularly those who had initially doubted her decision to speak up, began to see the value in reassessing their approaches. One afternoon, as the team completed a particularly challenging session, Dr. Simmons, the physician who had supported her early on, approached Emily. "Emily," he said, his voice gentle yet firm, "I want you to know that I admire what you've done here. I think all of us are learning a lot about how much we take for granted, even when we think we're treating everyone fairly." Emily felt a wave of relief at his words. "Thank you, Dr. Simmons. It means a lot to hear that. I know this hasn't been easy for anyone, but I'm hopeful that we're moving in the right direction." Dr. Simmons nodded thoughtfully. Change is never easy, especially in a place as established as this hospital. But sometimes it takes a shock to the system to remind us of what really matters. As the weeks passed, Emily noticed another shift, this time in the way patient complaints were handled. The administration had established a patient advocacy committee, with Lisa from Patient Advocacy leading the charge. She created an accessible feedback system, allowing patients to voice concerns anonymously or speak directly with advocates if they felt uncomfortable going through traditional channels. Every complaint, regardless of its nature, was documented and reviewed by the committee, who then addressed each one with a commitment to transparency and accountability. The effects were immediate. Patients and their families began to speak up more openly, sharing both positive feedback and concerns. Emily saw the difference firsthand in her rounds, as families grew more comfortable discussing treatment options and asking questions. For many patients, Bright Hope began to feel like a place where their voices mattered. In a poignant moment, Emily was called back to Mr. Jenkins' room. She hadn't seen him in a while, as he had been transferred to a different department during the height of the investigation. The familiar pang of worry struck her as she approached his room, wondering if he was all right. But when she entered, she was greeted with a sight that filled her heart with gratitude and relief. Mr. Jenkins was sitting up in bed, a warm smile on his face, his eyes bright. He looked healthier, more at ease, and there was a glow about him that she hadn't seen before. "Nurse Carter," he greeted her, his voice filled with warmth and gratitude. "I heard what you did. My daughter told me about the changes happening here. Thank you. You didn't just help me. You've helped a lot of people." Emily felt tears prick her eyes as she approached him, taking his hand gently. "Mr. Jenkins, it's because of you that all of this happened. You gave me the courage to speak up. I couldn't have done it without you." He gave her hand a gentle squeeze, his voice filled with emotion. "You didn't have to do it. You could have walked away like so many others. But you chose to stay and fight. That takes heart, Nurse Carter. And that's something they can't teach in any school." They shared a moment of silence, the weight of their shared experience settling between them. It was a quiet acknowledgement of the journey they had both taken, a testament to the power of standing up for what was right. After leaving Mr. Jenkins' room, Emily found herself drawn to the hospital's courtyard, a small oasis of green surrounded by the imposing brick walls. She sat on a bench beneath a tree, her mind racing with the memories of everything that had transpired. She had come to Bright Hope as a temporary nurse, hoping only to gain experience and perhaps secure a more permanent position. But now she had become a symbol of change within the hospital, a voice for the voiceless. Her phone buzzed, interrupting her thoughts. It was a message from Lisa, asking if she could meet her in the administrative office. Curiosity piqued, Emily made her way inside, her mind racing with possibilities. When she arrived, she found Lisa waiting for her, a smile on her face. "Emily," she began, "the board has decided to establish a new position, an advocate for patient rights and equity. Given everything you've done here, they'd like to offer the position to you." Emily's eyes widened in shock. "Me?" she stammered. I'm just a temp." "Not anymore," Lisa replied, her smile growing. "Your courage has inspired everyone here, Emily. This hospital needs someone like you, someone who understands the importance of patient advocacy, someone who's willing to stand up for those who can't stand up for themselves. The board believes that with you in this role, we can ensure that these changes become a lasting part of Bright Hope's culture." Emily felt her heart swell with a mixture of pride and disbelief. She had come here hoping to simply make a difference for Mr. Jenkins, but now she was being given the chance to make a difference for every patient who walked through Bright Hope's doors. She accepted the position with tears in her eyes, feeling the weight of the responsibility settle over her shoulders. In her new role, Emily dedicated herself to ensuring that every patient received fair and compassionate care. She worked closely with Lisa, Dr. Hart, and other members of the Patient Advocacy Committee, overseeing reforms and advocating for continuous improvements. Together, they established regular training sessions, streamlined complaint processes, and developed a reporting system that encouraged staff to voice concerns without fear of retribution. Emily's commitment to change inspired others, and slowly the hospital began to transform. Her colleagues, once skeptical, came to respect her integrity and dedication. Even Dr. Grant, initially resistant, eventually acknowledged the positive changes, though their relationship remained formal and somewhat distant. The hospital as a whole became more attuned to the needs of its patients, its staff becoming more empathetic and responsive. Months passed, and Emily's work continued to yield results. The hospital's patient satisfaction ratings began to improve, and word spread throughout the community that Bright Hope was committed to providing equitable and compassionate care. Families from all backgrounds felt welcomed and valued, and patients who had once hesitated to speak up found their voices. One day, as Emily walked through the bustling halls, she overheard two new nurses talking. "Have you heard about Nurse Carter?" One of them asked, her voice filled with admiration. "She's the one who started all these reforms. People say she's a hero." The other nurse nodded. "I know. It's incredible to think how much one person can change." Emily smiled to herself, feeling a sense of fulfillment that words couldn't express. She had always dreamed of making a difference, of helping people in their moments of vulnerability. Now she had done that and more. She had left a legacy, a foundation of compassion and justice that would carry on long after her time at Bright Hope. And she knew that, no matter where her career might lead her, she would always carry this experience with her. She had learned that one voice, no matter how small, could ignite a spark that could change the world. And though the journey had been filled with challenges, doubts, and sacrifices, she wouldn't have changed a thing. As Emily left the hospital that evening, the sun setting in a wash of golden light over the city, she felt a profound sense of peace. She was no longer just a temporary nurse or even just an advocate. She was a part of something much bigger, a movement toward compassion, respect, and equality in healthcare. And as she walked toward her future, she knew that whatever lay ahead, she would face it with courage and unwavering purpose, her heart forever committed to the patients who had taught her the true meaning of her calling.